Hey, CNFers. Brin-Jonathan Butler makes his fifth return visit to the greatest podcast in the world, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. He's as good as they come. As far as I'm concerned, there's nobody better. Subjective, I know, but whatever. Discover your story, man, with Bay Path University's fully online MFA in Creative Nonfiction Writing. Faculty have a true passion and love for their work. It shines through with every comment, edit, and reading assignment. The instructors are available to answer all your questions, and their years of experience as writers and teachers have made for an unbeatable experience. Head over to baypath.edu/MFA for more information. So episode 186 with Brin-Jonathan. I didn't edit the interview portion of the show. I just didn't have the time this week. And clearly I'm not going to edit me bungling the intro and butchering Brin's name. Episode 186 is with Brin-Jonathan Butler at Brinicio on Twitter. He's the very definition. Well, this show, this episode, this particular conversation is the very definition of a riff. That might make sense later. This isn't so much an interview so much as it is a riff. Oh yes. Real professional this week. Really polished. Good Lord. Brin's got a new podcast. It's titled Tourist Information, where he interviews these cats about boxing. Not cats, but cats. Gives you a sense of who he is as an interviewer, which is why one of the reasons I was really tickled to listen to his show, because I love his writing so much. His journalism is so good, and you want to know, how does this person pull information out of people so they can best synthesize that information into his beautiful prose. He's the author of the memoir Domino Diaries, The Grand Master. He's been a Best American Travel Writing, Best American Sports Writing, Notable Selection. You name it. He's all over it. He's as good as they come. It gives you, I don't know, it made me think about how interviewing is a skill. There's a difference between asking good questions and being a good interviewer. Good interviewers always ask good questions, but askers of good questions are not necessarily good interviewers. I could point to several podcasts about that, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stoop to that level. Not anymore. A few years ago, I would have been like, yep, that person is a piece of shit, and I'm better. Not anymore. Not anymore. We don't do that. Anyway, I got to say, my social media sabbatical's going well. I do promote the podcast here and there, but not having any of that garbage on my phone, excepting Instagram, has been nice. I definitely don't feel like I'm missing anything. A little bit here and there, but not a whole lot. You want to know what complete garbage Twitter is? I don't even mean like the trolling part of it. It gives you the evidence of just how, I don't know, meaningless it is. I put out a tweet this week at CNF Pod, if you want to follow along, telling people that if at least 10 people retweeted this one tweet, I'd raffle off my copy of Tim O'Brien's latest book. You know how many retweets that got? 1. That tells me a couple things. One, perhaps even if a tweet with the requisite hashtags, it is just invisible. Nobody's seeing it. The algorithms are such that when I tweet, it floats away. The other thing is that maybe people don't give a shit, and I can't do anything about that. But there's 725 followers of the @CNFPod account. That's not nothing, right? It further cemented how little social media matters and how disproportionately it takes up our attention for the value it adds in our lives, right? Frankly, I'd rather make a good podcast that you feel like you can nestle into for an hour a week. Don't forget to tweet it out. Okay, let's wrap things up here. All right, a few things. BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, for show notes, newsletter is the jam. The podcast, like I said earlier, It's unedited this week. Brin is probably my favorite writer going. He's the author, again, of The Grandmaster, Domino Diaries. He's at Bernicio on Twitter. His new podcast is Tourist Information. Step into the ring, CNFers.
It's odd how time compresses the further along you go, huh?
Yeah, it's amazing and kind of dispiriting to realize that, I feel like, just given that, I read your work and, you see people pop up on a Twitter feed, so you get a sense that you've been in touch with this person for a long time. Then you realize you see some concrete evidence that it's quite the opposite. You're like, holy shit, I haven't actually had a conversation with this guy in over 2 years. It is what it is, as they say, but it's nice to be talking to you again after over 2 years.
Likewise. Well, yeah. What's that? I think I was reading something by Michael Hare, his friendship with Stanley Kubrick, and he defined like a period of 7 years as one phone call with interruptions.
Right. Nice. Well, this is great. So how are things going for you? Given that we haven't spoken in a while, but how are things? It's it's good to hear your voice, and I'm glad to be able to hear you in podcast form too. So like, what's going on in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, man, just a different hustle after having the backdrop of a book, and so trying to freelance some stuff. A little bit more of a focus on travel than boxing.
Like leisure travel or work related?
Leisure travel. No, I mean writing about travel as a focus for work. Leisure travel. Yeah, my private jet going to visit Meghan Markle in my old neighborhood, and my own. It's funny because I actually, when I was 8, I won a raffle to go visit the Queen's arrival to Vancouver. And it's been a little bit funny to just loosely follow Meghan and Harry's, I guess, what is it, escape to my old stomping grounds, and to see it referenced endlessly that she was walking in the park with her kid in Vancouver. And I'm like, calling where she was Vancouver is like calling the Hamptons New York City. Like it's so far away from Vancouver. But for Americans, it's like it might as well be the Northwest Territories or something. Like it's all the same, it seems like.
Yeah.
This is funny. So yeah, I mean, I did a profile on DBC Pierre, the 2003 Booker Prize winner, where he grew up in Mexico City. I might have to go back to Vancouver, where I haven't been in 10 years, which is kind of odd, to do a story about a kidnapping that took place 30 years ago. And I have this story coming out probably next week for Hazlitt Magazine, next week or 2 weeks, about The Passenger and interviewing Jack Nicholson, and kind of coincides while I was reporting on that story in the south of Spain, where Antonioni was filming the last scenes of The Passenger. Anthony Bourdain's suicide was announced. And so it kind of became, I don't know, evocative of how prevalent a theme that is with a lot of artists, writers, painters, and this odd thing about revisiting a biography through the prism of their death, which I think is kind of unavoidable with suicide. So yeah, a lot of different stuff than boxing. I think since we last spoke has been kind of the focus.
Yeah, is that in any way kind of refreshing for you to kind of pivot off of that, and knowing you can always go back to it, but to just to go over to this sandbox?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think this is more my interest. I think boxing, maybe the consistent theme with like the characters that I'm drawn to are misfits, and I don't think anybody who gets involved in boxing isn't a misfit, like almost by definition of doing something that most people are terrified of their whole lives, and these people, it's their day job. So I always liked how boxing just revealed people more than sort of any kind of blow-by-blow account of what they were doing in the ring. And I also like the misfits who are drawn to boxing. You get such an interesting assembly of characters. I mean, I requested the seating arrangement for Pacquiao Mayweather from Showtime, and they allowed me to see what's called I'm going to get this wrong, it's like a giga photo. So essentially what that means, I'm saying it wrong. I'm getting it giga. Okay, I'm going to describe it instead of getting the word wrong. But what it is, which is quite interesting, is a high definition photo that basically shows the entire crowd, where you can zoom in on every face that was there. So I'm talking about like 12,000 people worth of faces that you can zoom in where you're 2 feet from them. So this was interesting for me because I think the seating arrangement for Pacquiao Mayweather might be the highest concentration of celebrity that's ever been assembled. When you think about, you have Trump surrounded by 20 billionaires, oligarchs and such. You have the award ceremony from the Oscars, the Grammys, comedy. It was just like, through this accident of boxing, it was sort of like looking at the seating arrangement of the Titanic. For one of like the hardest seats to get onto was like the Titanic for the early 20th century. So I was kind of looking at it like, if you were in charge of where prices is of no importance, I mean, some of those seats were going for $375,000. How do you say to like Puff Daddy, I'm sorry, but you can't sit in front of Jay-Z, or Trump, I'm sorry, but you can't be in front of this Chinese or Russian oligarch? Like I was just, it seems so emblematic of our time, of that status is everything. Right. But when the money is no object to go after what you're pursuing, how do you keep the egos in check when you're like offering where you get to sit, where it has nothing really to do with an event, even though that event seemed a perfect distillation of our time in that it was the biggest non-event. It was just, where are you sitting was the big thing. And I remember I was in the 7th row reporting on it, and behind me was Sting, Jesse Jackson, Louis C.K., Magic Johnson. I went to the bathroom and was using a urinal next to Dave Chappelle. We exit the bathroom, and Nicki Minaj, we're in orbit of her backside, where we're both looking at each other like, that can only be one person. And you were seeing more celebrities than faces you didn't know in like at the MGM Grand. So it just seemed, I don't know, like, these are where I seem to go with boxing more than who won or lost and who was winning the rounds. I mean, that's a very long-winded reply, but
this whole notion of status and status roles, who's up and who's down is, and how do you get up in relation to someone else going down is, it's almost a more interesting sparring duel than what's actually going on in the ring.
I think so. And I mean, you and I know, where most journalists live is Twitter, and I don't know that Twitter has much purchase on people outside of people on Twitter. I don't know that they follow what is maniacally followed by sort of journalist Twitter. So I am intrigued that sort of any arena of ambition, status is paramount, and the way that people jockey for that, as things become more kind of diffuse, like in terms of what we're focusing on, there's not events that bring everybody together anymore. We're not looking at the same thing anymore. We're finding our own pockets and our own bubbles to discuss it. And I'm not sure where any of this is headed, but it's really weird that a lot of life just seems like this hallway at high school during lunch hour or recess where we gossip. And that has taken over the discussion of sort of what seems to be more important things often, unless you're signaling about why it's important because you care about it and all that, which is, again, back to status.
Right. Yeah. And you see it too, like in just, if you go into any press box or media row, there is a certain, jockeying of position, even among, the tenured reporters and everything. And there is this sense of, who is the, who's the king of the row and who isn't. And I don't spend much time in press boxes anymore, but it's just like you get that sense of, of swagger when a certain person comes in, like, they get the first question, or, this, that, and the other. Who podcasting is like who can get the biggest fish on their show for a certain interview. You see it all the time everywhere, and like actually when you see it, you sort of can't unsee it ever again.
No, you can't. And I mean, even the New York Times, with who they're going to endorse with candidates, they turned it into like a Bachelor show, right?
Yeah.
Where it was like, let's interview all the people, and we're not even going to sign off on one person. We're going to be diplomatic here, lest there be this Twitter backlash. Or there was a recent review, I think it's the first negative review I've seen of Gia Tolentino, where talk about status, like how elevated she became with her work in the New Yorker. Again, prestigious status. You're at the New Yorker, and then she gets a book that is on Obama's book list, and the London Review of Books does a pretty scathing review of her. Lauren Oyler, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Oyler. In order to do a negative review, I noticed she had to get off of social media because of, I would assume, a horrendous backlash of supporters of Gia Tolentino. And then it's like, how much is that about supporting Tolentino, and how much of it is about, by supporting Gia Tolentino, you are shoring up your position, ideally, to gain like a better position at a job or at the New Yorker or whatever. There's so much performance to all of this that I think everybody is struggling with this battle between privacy and publicity, and especially in an industry that is imploding. I totally understand
Right.
why, but the mechanics of that kind of stuff, I think as I mentioned with Bourdain's suicide, his narrative to becoming what he did, like how unusual it was that, hey, I'm on the slush pile of the New Yorker, and I can't believe any of this happened. Almost none of that was true. And so I've always been very curious about how people calibrate and curate their narratives, and how much it lines up with the past. And I'm even finding, as I'm working on this profile about DBC Pierre, another guy quite like Bourdain, who wins the Booker Prize at 42 without ever having written anything, and having a kind of lost decade of drug addiction, alcoholism, gambling, conning people out of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debts. And it's been pretty interesting just trying to get the facts about a timeline of things happening, of what's on the record, what isn't, and a lot of things not lining up, and sort of trying to make sense of it in a careful way. But it does make me sort of think how everybody is just trying to find their way with telling their story in this industry, because I'm still as fascinated by writers and storytelling as I've ever been, but it's dealing with the social media realities of it, and a real difficulty of making a living doing it. You're seeing even the likes of the New York Times really having to pander in ways that seem pretty embarrassing.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah, I'm always drawn to profiles of artists, specifically writers and even chefs. I really love that kind of drive and rigor that often drives these people. And your conversation with DBC Pierre on your podcast was pretty was just pretty gripping. He's just a great talker. And what struck me too, like when you alluded to it, him winning the Booker Prize with basically the first book he ever wrote. It's like a lot of us would love to win such a thing and get onto that plane, but it's like, what if it happens too soon? And for him, it led to essentially a 10-year period of like trying to live up to that. And that must have been interesting for you to unpack. Like, what if you get that prize, but you're not equipped to have that prize yet, and you get it, and how do you process that and live up to it for the rest of your career? That must have been something very interesting for you to unpack with him.
Well, especially since, like, what's your resume to get there? Let's not forget, because he's competing against Margaret Atwood at that time and some real heavyweights. And I think there was a lot of dissension amongst that group to say, this guy he may have the chops with a book that is getting a lot of attention, but this guy hasn't jumped through the necessary hoops that we have. And if he hasn't gone to the right MFA program or doesn't have connections in the literary world, wait a second, like, then what's the point of these connections? What's the point of these MFA programs where a lot of people who go to it go there as much for the connections they're going to form as what they're going to learn? So he was really attacked hard in the media for this backstory, this tremendously salacious backstory, but it had the opposite effect in that it was the best publicity that the Booker Prize had probably ever had outside of literary circles. So in a way, it made him almost a must win for the Booker, because if you're in the shortlist and everybody's just talking about your backstory rather than the books that are competing for the prize, it'd be a weird thing if he lost, and then it's sort of like, oh, the guy who didn't win it has this great backstory that we still want to keep talking about, rather than the books that were written for people that aren't reading those books, like in the pages of London, not tabloids, but even the newspapers were all covering his thing. So I was really interested in him unpacking that side of things. And the other side of it that was kind of interesting was what he wanted to do is, first we went to Mexico City where he grew up. His father was an agricultural geneticist who was partnered with a Nobel Prize winner, and the climate down in Mexico City allows for, I think, 3 harvests, where most places would just have one. So it was a tremendous place to develop food for places where food shortages were just rampant. In Africa and India and stuff, I think, was their focus of trying to find ways to just produce more food. And then what Pierre wanted to do, aside from growing up in this big gated community that he took me to in the southeastern part of Mexico City, was go to Oaxaca to visit somebody who had written to him, who had said that they'd been greatly inspired by his work, which was also how I became a pen pal of Pierre for about 9 years, was just saying, you're kind of the patron saint of people that can make it who don't have the qualifications to make it, which is certainly me. And
Misfits.
What he wanted, Misfits. And he wanted to go to Oaxaca to meet this guy who was a drug runner dealing with the cartel, had been a pimp for a while, then had become himself a prostitute, had worked with Larry Flint at Hustler to go cover the Bunny Ranch in the early 2000s, and was covering a mother-daughter prostitution team, and then married the daughter of one of these, and had been living illegally in Oaxaca. And so he had a 2 million word manuscript that nobody had ever seen. And so what Pierre suggested to me was, we could do some other things, or we can kind of stage a literary intervention, as it were, with a 43-year-old guy that is addicted to smack for the last 25 years, and we can see if we can do some good and try to help him get this manuscript somewhere. It's just we don't know what the manuscript is. And so it was odd that of the 3 of us being misfits of in various ways, Pierre made good in a way that was just so unlikely and unexpected with the Booker Prize. I'm somewhere as the half known in the industry with a few books out there, and journalism for 8-9 years. And then the question was kind of, where is this guy going to land? What if he gets this manuscript through some people that Pierre knows or somebody that I know, and somebody has a look at it? What is it if you're 43 and nobody's really seen the great work that you have? And when they do, what if it doesn't do anything and nobody wants it? Or what if it amounted to getting a shitty review in the New York Times or somewhere else? Or what if it's he becomes like a William Burroughs or something for his time? So it's just interesting to think about that, for how many people long to be in the position of being heard, which is, I think, like the big motivation behind most writers, is we want somebody to read us, right? As much as to make money from it. Remember, Glenn Stout said, I think at the beginning, the introduction of the best American sports writing book, that, a lot of writers are going to end up having to pay to be published places, and they'd be very willing to, because we're so desperate just to try to be heard in that way.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that was kind of the dynamic that I was most intrigued by in that assignment, was just where do we land when our work is seen, and how important is the timing at which it's seen, which unfortunately I think timing is almost everything with this, as much as the quality of the work or who you are presenting the work.
Was there a profile on? Were you going to be working on a profile of Pierre anyway, or was it this sort of this literary sort of this intervention? Is that what you're like? Oh, this is the animating force of this, and that was your gateway into profiling him for Hazlitt, right? That's where you're writing it for.
That's right. No, it was going to be Pierre. I really wanted to do the Mexico City thing, and a writer that I've always loved was Malcolm Lowry, and Malcolm Lowry, like Pierre, got his big jump with Under the Volcano, not far away from Mexico City in Cuernavaca. But that book launched him in a way where I think the New York Times said it was the greatest book written since Joyce's Ulysses, and it just destroyed his life. And I think for Pierre, probably the success he had, I think Vernon God Little sold around 1.2 million copies. That's what Pierre told me. Just a monster. Even though it did absolutely nothing in the United States, it was panned by both the New Yorker and the New York Times. So I wanted to look at the origin of this very nebulous origin story that he had up close. Go with him. Let's visit the house where you grew up. Let's go to the places that meant something to you in Mexico City. Let's look at how you descended into addiction when your father died when you were 19. He got brain cancer when Pierre was 16. He got arrested trying to bring a car in from Texas into Mexico and lost his Mexican visa. And then he's just kind of drifting. And once I kind of set up like a time where Pierre had a window to go down there, he was finishing a new book called Dopamine City, which really interested me. He's very fascinated by neuroscience. And actually, I just interviewed a neuroscientist for my podcast, Tourist Information, who specialized in dopamine, brain trauma, and loved boxing. So it was a fortunate intersection. But Pierre just said, look, like, we can do my story, but as we're doing my story, let's look at a kindred spirit who I think I very easily could have been. I got off the train at a certain stop. I was able to get off the train of where I was going for self-direction. And this guy's gone a little further than me. And I think there'd be something really useful in trying to understand where I was coming from, to see somebody who followed a similar path and went further down the tracks on that path. So that was our agenda. But Mexico, of the top 6 murder capitals in the world, Mexico has 5 of them. And this guy's involved in the cartel, involved in prostitution, drug running, is a drug addict of 25 years. There were some risks associated with it. And then just the backdrop of we're there just before the Day of the Dead. And so Pierre suggested I do some interviews with what's called the Nota Roja, the red letter, which is the death press down there that puts graphic depictions of the cartel's most vicious murders of men, women, and children on the front pages of all their newspapers and tabloids for everybody to see, just walking around the streets. And their relationship to death is something that I was very intrigued by and troubled by. And Pierre's book, making essentially a very dark comedy about a school shooting where the suspected shooter is put into a reality show while he's on death row as a teenager. And remember, this came out in 2003. This is before the Kardashians. This was pretty prophetic to, I think, where we are now, where what was dismissed as sort of South Parkian take on American culture now looks not even like naturalism. It looks understated to where a lot of things are now. So I mean, even the title of the book was a reference to bullfighting, which was, I think it's a 21st century comedy in the presence of death. And that's an expression of how bullfighting is treated, that it's a tragedy in the presence of death. And he got the impetus for the book by a school shooting that took place in the Northwest in Oregon in April of 1998. A year later, Columbine happens, and he literally signs the book deal 45 minutes before the first plane hit the tower for 9/11. So there was just a lot there about death and his way of treating that subject, that he mentioned to me that Vernon God Little was a Latin novel that was written in English. Like the sensibility of it was much more like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who, by the way, he went to school with two of Marquez's kids in Mexico City, and said, I don't know if it's a hindrance or an advantage when Marquez is on the curriculum for these two kids to write essays about dad, to write essays about Gabo. So I don't know. These are just themes. I think death and time have always been really big themes in what I've been drawn to in my work, usually as a backdrop, but I think this put it much more into the foreground for me, to look at Pierre to look at this guy that we just had a dinner with at night, as it sounded like there was cannon fire while we were interviewing him, and he called the dinner off at the end just because he said he needed to do drugs. Like it was just too difficult for him to continue talking, even though there he was sitting with a literary hero of his. And I'm also very interested, having dealt with in my own family with the effects of addiction, is, can you really intervene and help somebody? Like, what can you really do? How do you do that? If somebody doesn't want to be helped, then what do you do? And this just seemed such an unlikely opportunity to potentially be of assistance to this guy. And so in the intervening 2 months since we did that interview, and I was working on the profile, I've gone through 55,000 words that he's written, that I think is a very limited part of this 2 million words that he thinks is his great tome about his life. And it's just very interesting to see somebody driven to try to speak out about who they are in this world and all the regrets he's had. But boy, just suicide and regret and a lot of shame just permeate everything that's in it. And yet there must be some hope in that he just keeps going. I mean, 2 million words. So there are a number, it's hard not to see parallels with some of the other people out there that are now beloved. My 40th birthday, I was in France and sort of doing the trail of Van Gogh from just north of Paris, where he took his own life, to Saint Remy, where he was being hospitalized. And just to imagine that there's a pilgrimage trail where millions and millions and millions of people are visiting because of the connection they feel to this guy. And yet in his own life, before he took it in 1890, had no idea that anybody would ever give a shit. Like, he was just contending with that nobody fucking cared. And I certainly can connect to that with many years of trying my best to try to get some work out there and just failing and failing and failing. So I still have a lot of, probably not too much empathy for those people, but it's hard to get the chip off your shoulder and the feeling of support for people who are underdogs out there, because there's a lot of them.
And to your point of like failing and failing and failing, I look at your body of work, and I just see so much I admire, but you see, you have the viewpoint of having carrying your various failures, and they're probably if you're anything like me, they're probably very, very much on the forefront of your mind almost all the time. So like, how have you mitigated that, the failure? How do you dance with it and use it as fuel, and not let it weigh you down too much, so you can still, put out the stuff you're able to crank out?
Well, I think the real benefit of failure is that I think losing at anything, I was involved in a program that was on Netflix, a series called Losers. And I did all the interviews for the first episode of that, and brought this ex-heavyweight champion who was nearly killed in his next fight, Michael Bent, who's transitioned into acting
He's played Othello on stage and done the choreography for Clint Eastwood in Million Dollar Baby, the boxing choreography, and also in Ali, the Michael Mann biopic of Ali. And what came to the forefront working on that film and just working with Michael Bent, who's become a pretty good friend of mine, is that losers are forced to confront who they are. We're forced to look at ourselves every time we confront something where we didn't get where we wanted to go. The perennial winners of this world, I mean, look at the pathology of a Lance Armstrong or a Donald Trump, where everything is about winning, right? There's nothing immoral about what you do to win. The only thing that's immoral is if you lose. And that's, it's a very binary outlook of the world. So I think it's been very fortunate. It wasn't in real time particularly enjoyable, but to write 3 books that were unpublishable and to get a lot of rejection letters in a time where you couldn't electronically send it. So it cost a fair bit of money to send out all those manuscripts all over the place. I don't think those books were publishable. I think I needed to write them, but I don't think they weren't for anybody else. And after some years of churning stuff out there, where maybe if you think that writing is going to solve a lot of your problems in terms of your identity or things you don't like about yourself, if you got a bunch of validation at a point where you weren't developed enough, I think internally, or mature enough, I think you're going to be a lot more fucked up than trying to deal with some of the frustration that's involved with the persistence of keeping going despite meeting failure. I mean, I know with Pierre, who's probably the only living writer that I regularly talk to, it was really hard for him in the 17 years since he won the Booker Prize, because everything is measured against, hey, you just won the biggest English language prize in the world, or one of them, straight out of the gates. How could you ever write anything that's going to measure up to that? It's like Orson Welles syndrome, where you're the youngest has-been ever in Hollywood. Yeah. And I've heard Mark Maron make the point that if you go to Hollywood and are substituting the needs you have from your parents with Hollywood, they're going to solve all those needs you have for validation and stuff. You're in real trouble. And so I think for me also, the Grandmaster was an interesting thing in that it's a for hire assignment. I was told what to do, what basically the book was that was wanted. And as that became untenable with a chess match that was really not that compelling objectively, I was pushing back to say, look, I need to do this some other ways, because what the assignment was I was given is really not what can be written. And there was a lot of friction there in publishing. When you get your advance to do your book, if you deliver something that they don't like, they don't have to have any justification to say, we don't like this, you owe us all the money back. And that was really, really frightening. I mean, I didn't have any other means of supporting myself, and I certainly didn't have any means to pay that money back. So to then get the book out there with a major publishing house like Simon & Schuster, and to get it reviewed in the New York Times, and the New York Times review is something about the book that really had nothing to do with the book that I wrote, or when people write criticism and cite lines that actually I didn't write, like those were things that had to be in there. When you immediately get that kind of feedback that's negative, it's sort of like, you are really angry and pissed off and frustrated. But I think on the other hand, you're just kind of like, well, wait a minute, like, what does this have to do with me? When somebody says, this match is not that compelling to tether a book to, I'm kind of like, you're right, but I had to. So sorry, I did my best there. Or the New York Times says, is chess a sport? This book argues that it is. Well, I argued that it was in about 3 sentences, because when I didn't do that, my editor said, we absolutely need this to be in here. So, okay, like, that's your angle on this thing? Well, that really wasn't what I wrote. But if that's what you want to focus on, and a lot of people said to me, it doesn't make any difference if it's panned. all people will look at 6 months from now, it was reviewed in the New York Times. That's its own thing to assist you in the resume. And back to Margaret Atwood, she was one of three judges in Canada with their biggest nonfiction award, and it was shortlisted there, the RBC Taylor Award. And it's like, it's just so interesting to me that a book where it's a weird thing, like I say, where so much of what the book is not how you would do it organically. It's really what you were, not paint by numbers quite, Brendan, but largely it was a little bit of, this has got to be a pizza, and it's got to be a microwavable pizza. And you're sort of like, well, I want to be a chef. Well, that's great, but this is a microwavable pizza for people who want microwavable pizzas.
Right.
And at first I was really angry about that and upset and really didn't want my name attached to that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I was like, I was able to live on this for 3 years. And is it the worst thing in the world that you'll get some negative reviews, and then, some other places it might be appreciated? It's nice to be nominated for the biggest nonfiction award in Canada, even though it's no longer existing, because I guess it's not viable to support Canadian nonfiction. But you're just kind of like, I think you just let it go in the rear view mirror, and I think it's on you to reduce the high beams of how that feels and just look back at the windshield about where you want to go. Because like you're saying, it's been almost 2 years since you and I talked. It seems like it was last week. And, in the meantime, I'm meeting a lot of people who are dealing with marriages falling apart, or a new child, or a loved one is dying and stuff. I mean, life is happening in the meantime. And if you don't wake up in the morning and get to work, it can become very easy to become untethered from your life and float off into some place which is not a good spot to be in. And so I'm very aware of that. It's very easy, especially in New York, in the United States, to this deafening amount of noise and stress that is just part of being alive right now. You really have to find the things that are of value to focus on, that give your life meaning, and the people that give you your life meaning, that you care about and support you, and that you support, and control what you can control, and accept what you can't control. And I've always, especially the last 5-6 years, tried my best to really focus on that and manage it the best I can as a very, very neurotic individual.
That kind of gets what I wanted to ask you next too, because you're at the start of a new decade, and I wonder how your relationship to your work and your writing and ambition might have changed or morphed, say from when you were 30 to now when you're 40.
Yeah, I mean, finding the stories that are meaningful. I think it gets harder and harder to make a living from this craft. I mean, I fell ass backwards in a very goofy way to a book with a major publishing house like Simon & Schuster. I mean, not a lot of people get an offer to do a for-hire assignment for places like that, and 3 days later sign the book deal, and 2 days later are covering it. That just doesn't really happen. So when I bring up Anthony Bourdain is discovered on a slush pile at the New Yorker, even though that's not true. His mom worked at the New York Times, was friends with David Remnick's wife, and gave her, who gave Remnick that work that led to Kitchen Confidential and a massive book deal. Like, that's the real story. He was a hugely connected person, but still, it's unlikely to get your start at 42. I'm just aware of how much timing and luck and I guess persistence as well has led to some opportunities, but I don't know where the next book is, which is a scary feeling, because it is a huge amount of security to have a chunk of change. And I didn't have any massive book deal, but I mean, for me to have 2.5 years to be able to focus on that and do some freelance, but for the first time in my adult life, not be afraid of where am I going to find the money to pay the rent. It's always a hustle. I still teach boxing. I'm still going to the same tunnel that was on the cover of the New York Times Metro section to train people in the dead of winter. And I remember when that happened, I had a lot of friends say, you're on the cover of the Metro section of the New York Times. Your life is going to be completely different. It wasn't. Like nothing changed. I got 2 clients who were Upper East Side, extraordinarily wealthy people, where we did 1 lesson and I never heard from them again. Like nothing really changed. So this idea, and I don't know if you're this way, but I certainly had hugely romantic attachments to the origin myths of the likes of F. Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway or Marguerite Duras or Patricia Highsmith, where that book comes up or that movie taken from their book and they're launched and they're flying and it seems like they can write whenever they want, they can travel whenever they want, but really real life is they don't have to deal with the regular stuff. Just like you listen to the long form podcast, and as much as they talk about diversity with gender or race, you know what kind of diversity they don't talk about? Socioeconomic status. You're not hearing a lot of people that had to pay student loan debt. When you're hearing about people who are quote unquote broke, it's a very relative term when your parents are doctors and lawyers and you're broke. And, so you're finding that journalism is becoming kind of a field trip for people that are rich. And increasingly, it's only rich people that are participating in it. And that interests me and that's not completely new. I mean, Gertrude Stein discovers Picasso and she finds all this great artwork. Do you know how she was doing that? She was living off of a massive amount of money from her brother Leo, or Virginia Woolf writing those great books. She's fucking rich. Of course she has time to write. She doesn't have to have a day job. There's a lot of it, for Hemingway in Paris, well, he's starving in Paris. No, he's not. He's living off of his wife's trust fund, which was a 7-figure trust fund in today's dollars. Like there's a lot of bullshit about the romanticism of starving artists that when you actually go to a granular level of how they're living, they're not fucking starving. Far, far from it. And I do have this kind of perpetual terror of being on a kind of conveyor belt that's drawing me over a cliff economically. And every little assignment or book deal gives me a little room on that conveyor belt treadmill to get a little further away from the cliff. But I definitely feel like I don't know where the lever is to shut it off. I'm being drawn over. And I've always felt that a bit emotionally too, is I'm trying to find some things to stabilize me. But I think there's a deficient machine here. It's like a hemophiliac. I don't know how to plug the stuff that's bleeding out of me a little bit. I'm just trying to find more ways to create what's a blood infusion to sustain me. And that's a curse, but I think it can also be a real blessing. Maybe if you don't have that fear, you don't take some chances that can lead to some stuff. And I'm definitely somebody that's had to take some chances to make some things happen. You're also aware at 40, unlike 30, I feel my vulnerabilities a lot more. I feel a lot more fragile. There's a F. Scott Fitzgerald line, don't confuse arthritis for a stiff joint, but sometimes you confuse a stiff joint for arthritis. It works both ways, or I inverted that, but I mean, sometimes a stiff joint is not a stiff joint. It is arthritis. You are getting older. You can't do some of the things that you used to do. I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since I started the chess book. And it's like, is that the rest of my life that I'm an insomniac? I don't know. And I don't know how it happened. I've never had problems with sleeping before. My mother sends me fucking care packages that is just nothing but this herbal mumbo jumbo bullshit that is really not doing anything. I'm taking the Michael Jackson propofol equivalent of melatonin every night just to try to get 4 hours sleep. I'm practically intravenously using orange flavored melatonin, but it's kind of like you just wonder sometimes with those kind of things, you've got to look after yourself the best you can. Again, controlling what you can control and being aware of if the rest of my life is going to operate on 3 hours sleep, I'm already noticing pretty serious memory loss. I'm not functioning the way I used to function So you kind of have to make some adjustments to deal with it. And it reminds me a little bit of some boxers, who Muhammad Ali is as a 21-year-old Cassius Clay, where you have the ability to rely on your athleticism and timing and speed and all that. It's very different when you slow down, and it's not so easy to be able to jump around. It's not so easy to take advantage of people because your reflexes are so much better. So you have to become a little bit more canny and selective and pick your spots a little more. And I don't know if it makes you better. I guess hopefully you can mitigate how much worse you're getting. But I've managed to find 3 stories to work on that I'm very drawn to, that paid a lot better than the kind of slop pay that you get for most things that are out there. I'm still doing jobs where I have to go on social media and shame the people to actually pay me for like the work I've done. Right. Done it twice. And it's fascinating because you get all these emails from them. They finally respond and say, why are you putting this on social media? What are you doing? Of course we're going to pay you. Well, you didn't respond to 7 emails. Yes, right. I never saw them. Well, here they are. Oh, well, we would never ordinarily do this. It's just so intolerable that you would shame us. It's so disproportionate. I have rent to pay. Fuck you. When you say you're going to pay me. And I can only imagine if you're a journalist trying to start out, and that's the reality of is just you're disposable, and their attitude toward writers are, there's just so many of them, like, why bother having to pay? And there's fewer and fewer spots where you can just, my friend Thomas Hauser, Muhammad Ali's biographer, told me that he used to do Q&As for Penthouse with, like, I think he did Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and a few other sort of New York celebrities. You could get like $15,000 for doing a 2-page Q&A that you could probably write up in an hour and a half of like early 1980s money. I had a thing from the chess book, like when the World Championships were going on, that was a 2-pager in Playboy, and the print edition, you get $1,000. Playboy is not easy to get into.
Right.
So like I say, if you or my son or daughter said, my dream is to become a journalist, it's really weird to be in that position to be like, great, I want to support you, but be ready. You've got a lot of really fucking talented people vying for very, very few spots that in any way could give you a hope in hell of supporting yourself. And you're probably going to have to go to a major city in order to do it. And rent is not cheap. So, I really admire some people. I had to come to New York just because a lot of the people were passing through here. Boxing is a New York thing or a Las Vegas thing. Like, you kind of have to be on one coast or the other to cover that sport. And there was no barrier to entry with boxing. Thank fucking God. So right. you could bullshit your way into getting a credential and then just keep going and off you go. That's getting a lot harder. The walls are a lot harder to figure a way around or through or under in this industry. So I'm really amazed at a lot of people that are fighting the good fight and producing really good work, and especially when they're not really getting compensated very much, or there's no money to really report on it, on the stuff that they're doing the way it needs to. It's always like very interesting to see people who are on a staff job making, 6 figures or $200,000, $300,000 a year say, yeah, this was a good story, but, it just wasn't reported enough. And it's like, well, that's not because the writer didn't want to. It's because they couldn't. And you can, and you don't have to think about it. And everything you do is expensed. And you're on a salary where you own a home and don't have to deal with a lot of these stresses of, being in a shitty, loud, or dangerous neighborhood, or, like being able to pay your medical bills or go to the dentist or whatever. And so I meet those kind of people on both sides. And it's interesting how little they know of how each other lives. Same with subjects. I did a profile in Oakland of Andre Ward, and he's like, this is what journalists really need to do, Brin, is come out here, spend a week with the subject, like find the real story. And I'm like, it's not that other journalists don't want to do this. It's that nobody will send them to do this. Do you get that? Do you get that 98% of people who cover boxing don't get paid? that they just get a credential to go to the fight, but they're not paid? He had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, and why would he have an idea, right? Like, how would he know that? So those are some of the things like I guess the backstage pass to some of the stuff that is interesting, but it's probably only interesting to us. Like, I don't think regular people give a flying fuck about it, which I get.
What's great about, speaking of projects and so forth, what I love about your podcast is I like hearing how, I've been reading your writing for years, and then of course, I don't get necessarily a backstage pass to how you go about interviewing the sources, and I felt it's kind of great to see for lack of a better term, the performance about how you're going about getting information and having these conversations. And I wonder how close your interviewing style for the podcast is to your actual reporting style, or if they are one and the same.
No, they're definitely different. You're right. It's performance, and I don't have to. I mean, even though I know the audio quality of the first several episodes has been dog shit, because a lot of times it's been a work in progress figuring out the right equipment, which I think you've solved a hell of a lot better than I have. I have recently bought a very good Zoom and some better microphones and stuff. So starting with this neuroscientist, the stuff is going to change, because it needed to, if we're going to force me to pronounce chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Does that sound right?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Epigenetics, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Yeah, no, I had to really work on it, because the Aaron Hernandez documentary, I was like, I need to not sound like a complete idiot and reference Ian Robertson and stuff. And I'm interested in it, but I'm still a complete layman to it. I think I definitely feel like I'm channeling a lot more of my mother as like a spiritual therapist, where like there's the element of her channeling spirits in order to delve into the darkness of who the people are that she's been talking to for decades now. I mean, 35 years she's been doing therapy with people that have kind of exhausted every other area of going to a conventional therapist or a psychiatrist, and they seek out my mother with, the thick Hungarian accent and crazy blue eyes, just opening like a horse in fire to sort of go into them. I think that there's a part of that, of what she taps into with her intuition, and just that she's passionately interested in the people she's talking to. I mean, she doesn't meet anybody, I think, where she just doesn't. She reminded me of Troy from Star Trek, The Next Generation, the Beta Z having the psychic connection, the half human, half Beta Z psychic connection. My mother just has that quality of just really locking into somebody. And I think I have part of that from her, where that I am chasing. I was thinking about this the other day, the cross currents of the impulse to do trophy hunting, like the Trump kids, versus the kind of people who love their pets so much they want to stuff them, like taxidermy, so that the cat never dies. It's just like there on a chair or something by the bed. And that's interesting, right? Like that's our relationship to these animals. They're both really drawn to animals. I'm much more of the latter, even though I could never. That's the most disgusting thing imaginable, to have my cat Raoul next to me as a stuffed perched animal looking at me as I'm working. But I understand the impulse in that I am emotionally bracing for losing my animal every day and every time I look at him. And I think that when you're meeting a subject, part of how I think about meeting them is I have done all this research on who they are. I've researched for the last 8 months a kidnapping of a 21-year-old kid who kidnapped a billionaire's daughter 30 years ago in Canada. And I have read every single criminal-related instance of his life. I've read psychiatric accounts of his parole board, which happened 3 times. I have done this deep dive into him that maybe is deeper than any, I've spent 8 months on it, just doing nothing but research on somebody who has no idea I'm delving into their life. And it is a partly like the voyeur in me is just utterly fascinated by it, because it's sort of like how a portrait artist has an excuse to stare at a face up close for 7 hours or 10 hours a day and then come back and do the same thing. We never get to do that, right? Because you never are given a passport to do that. You're just a weirdo or whatever. But in journalism, you get to do it from a distance. So I find that if I'm doing all of that, and if I make the decision, and I've got it all lined up through Corrections Canada, their media person, I have all these connections to go after this guy, to like push the button and say, I want to fly over and interview you. Nobody has interviewed you in the 30 years since you did this horrible crime. And then be in a room with him and record it. The beautiful thing about that for me, that now that I'm doing podcasts, is I don't have to worry about the fucking audio quality. I don't have to worry that he speaks in a full sentence, or that it's, rendered for an audience that knows nothing about his crime. It's for me, and I am informed, and I am obsessed with it, and him, and all of these features of his case, of the crime, of how the very little bits of information I have of him talking to other people about the crime, like it can be really intimate. And I find it's very different having a quote unquote intimate exchange with somebody where they know it's going out publicly. And like there's an element of this that's really interesting. I don't know if were you ever a fan of Candid Camera?
Oh yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I would catch it on like Nick at Night or something.
Okay, so Candid Camera began with Alan Funt with Candid Microphone, and he was in World War II, and he'd record people, and what he found was, while he was recording them for the radio, as soon as the red light came on, the conversation just became stilted, or at least a lot more stilted, and he's like, we need to do something about this. So he'd do pre-interviews, disabled the red light, and then the pre-interview became the interview, and he was just like, let's just use this, it's better. And that idea that if you get somebody who is not performing, you get a lot better, more revealing stuff, which I don't think is always true. I think even when you're performing, that artifice reveals a lot of stuff too. What kind of makeup somebody applies to themselves to look a certain way, you can reverse engineer that to find a lot of truths as well, as much as, the Instagram celebrity who's not wearing makeup. Look at how genuine and sincere she, like that becomes its own performance. So there's an element of with Funt really deconstructed this pull we have, this struggle about performance versus privacy. And initially he was hated for what he was doing with Candid Microphone. It was intrusive, it was prurient, it was lurid. And then very quickly people were like, but I'd like it to happen to me, because I'd like people to hear what I have to say. Like it became its own version of social media and Instagram, right? Where just as human beings, we just can't not be taking selfies of wherever the fuck we are and what we're eating, and every quotidian, not even quotidian, but just the microscopically boring, arrestingly boring things that we consider, think about, do. It needs to be shared. Truman Show goes from dystopian nightmare in 1998 to it's a dystopian nightmare to not be on a reality show for kids 5 years later. Well, how the fuck did that happen? But we're just wired this way. So I'm always really conscious, and I feel very frustrated with doing the podcast, because like I have a producer there who's managing the equipment. I have sometimes a producer who's a fucking millennial who wants to photograph us talking, which makes me want him to be drawn and quartered, because I just can't. It's not the same thing as, Brandon, I want to talk to you about doing your podcast. I'd like to come out to Oregon. Could we go someplace where you're comfortable? And I'm just going to record this conversation. This is not going anywhere, but like, let's just talk about it. And after we talk about it, even if I use anything, I'm going to run that by you, so you can feel totally safe. And I've noticed, even, I think, just having pretty civilized conversations with people where I'm not trying to do anything gotcha, but like even Ben Anderson the HBO war correspondent. I went to his house. We have a conversation. I pushed back a little bit to kind of look at, because I've always been fascinated by war correspondence. That's kind of what got me into writing, was the work of Michael Hare and George Orwell. And Jesus, it's going to piss me off if I don't get her name right.
Like Martha Gellhorn, right?
Yes,
you guys.
That's it. God, it's because of Hemingway and all his wives and she would hate that because she despised more than anything being known as Hemingway's third wife. But those were people that he was very drawn to. And so when we were trying to go back to who was he before he was a war correspondent, why do you need to go to the front lines of these horrible war zones when, like, you're in Northern England, like, deal with coal mining? Why not just do local? There's, why do we have to be a celebrity who need, Madonna going into some sub-Saharan African country to find a child when, like, there's a lot of kids who are on the street in New York, like on the Upper East Side, or like around you, Madonna. But it becomes performative. But it's interesting. Like, why does it need to be a global thing instead of a national thing, instead of a civic thing, instead of a neighborhood thing, instead of dealing with your own house kind of thing? You know what I mean? So with him, when he was talking about some of the stuff he did before he got into writing, he mentioned one item, and he was like, I need to take this out because some things in my life right now, I just don't want this out there. And I understand you weren't trying to, like, you didn't get this out of me or anything. I said it, but I have to be more conscious of this detail. And so it was already up, like it had been up for an hour. And I don't know, it's like a weird feeling that I don't know if you do this in your mind, but as you're listening to your subjects, are you underlining what are the interesting bits to quote, to pull quote, or, what would be a good gateway drug into the bulk of the interview if you put this on Twitter or you put this on your website related to them? I mean, I'm certainly doing it. I can't listen to people and not highlight and underline as they're talking.
Yeah, that usually comes to me in the edit.
In the edit, yeah.
Yeah, when I'm listening back through, I'm like, okay, that's the tweet worthy thing that'll pull people in. This one probably won't get edited because I need to turn it around for tomorrow. But,
Good.
Yeah, I'm pretty much just gonna export this and add my intro and outros and call it a day. But yes, that's usually, you're like, oh, there are things that my brain will just hook onto. And oftentimes those are the things I kind of double down on as I'm talking to people. They just, like, I put a pin in it and we come back to that, and that just seems to really animate the conversation. But yeah, it's just like you underline it, like, oh, that's good. That's good for the audiogram. That's good for the pull quote, and that'll be like you said, the gateway into this deeper and broader conversation.
And you got to do it, right? I mean, like, it's part of the job. And yeah. I'm aware doing these podcasts, it's just there's a part of me that really wants to operate behind the scenes to make stuff happen. Like, that's the blessing of maybe the 20-year-old self wants to be on stage to do something with writing, because I do think writing very much is performance for people that are like, don't photograph me. I don't want to be seen. This is so embarrassing. I just hear it endlessly when I listen to interviews of writers is, how did I get here? And it's like, you don't get here unless you wanted to be here. Mm-hmm. You just don't. And it's its own performance to say, I don't want to be here and I'm here. Right. It's its own way of patting yourself on the back to be like, I'm not somebody who consciously cultivated blah, 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 blah. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but again, it's this element of privacy versus publicity. And I mean, I thought that was the most interesting thing of that Gia Tolentino, who I think is a great writer. And I mean, I think she's navigating some very stressful waters with her career and all that. I mean, New Yorker is not an easy place to write for. It's a very strenuous place to be fact checked and the kind of criticism you can get from people who are maybe jealous of your position. But when she got some pushback from that London Review of Books, even she had to acknowledge, like, boy, like this person got me in a bunch of ways. And I feel that way too, that when you go out there on stage with an essay, we're doing a line of work where you can't be there to say, please keep going, it gets better. It actually has to be good. It actually has to find a lot of people you don't know and reach them where they are and be meaningful and of use and of service to them and fucking entertaining to them to make their load a little bit less. And that's what is going to create the momentum. You know, your script being read in their voice, in their head, is a very intimate connection. It's what makes this magical, that we are always, in a sense, like writing the script for the private theater and the imagination of our readers. And if you betray that relationship, or it's perceived as betrayed because they're like, I don't like my voice reading this stuff. I don't like imagining the people this male or female author is writing for me. You know, it's like the moment you see their name again or any words from them, you're just like, fuck them. You know, it becomes, you become othered very quickly, because if you're not othered and somebody lets you in to their imagination, it's a very, there's all kinds of benefits passively of the enjoyment we get from binge watching anything, going to a movie theater and all that. But it's a totally different drug, what we're offering when it's really good. You know, the writers that you and I love and who reach us, it's like, it's not an accident that like DBC Pierre is the only living writer I would ever want to meet and spend time with. And I don't mean journalist. I know a lot of journalists, but I mean in the sense of fiction writer. It's enough to have the work. I don't particularly want to have coffee with them. I don't want to share a cigarette with them. I'm cool that they're out there, but he was one of the only ones where I just thought, I have a hunch we're going to get along. And maybe most of these writers would not particularly want to get along with me. You know, I don't know, but I never just really had the sense that I would want to meet them. And I noticed, I don't know about you, I'm curious what you think about this, but I find it really interesting that most of the emotional lives of journalists today, as far as I can tell, is really lived on Twitter. A lot of them have real dysfunctionality with relationships. They're like only children, where the performance seems to be like, look what I painted here, grown-ups, look what it is. And it's a really odd dynamic. I don't know why it became that it's sort of like this idea of, I don't know, the performative nature of being a writer or journalist chasing after things. Maybe this is from fucking Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford and this romanticizing of journalism. But it's odd to me that it's like an academic pursuit now, when it used to always be a blue collar pursuit up until very recently. Right? Like it was just a trade that people fell into. A lot of people hadn't graduated high school. They certainly didn't go to college. They certainly didn't go to great colleges, Ivy League colleges. And now the background of writers is pretty much the same. Like they kind of all have the same backgrounds. Their parents had the same jobs. They had the same sort of socioeconomic status. Like there's a homogeneity to it that is pretty fascinating. And even where, I mean, I know the industry skews enormously white and male, but even the women or minorities that are in it, socioeconomically, they're not coming from a lot of the backgrounds that they're covering, right? Like in terms of like they came from affluence in many cases. At least that's the impression that I glean from listening to a lot of the interviews of them. And I listen to a lot of interviews. I'm fascinated by it and trying to I don't know, just see how people navigate this stuff and present this kind of thing. And maybe this is just, you know, my own form of entertainment at 40. Like maybe I should not pay attention to any of it, just pay attention to what I'm writing. But it is because it doesn't feel good to follow it, frankly. I don't feel good ever looking at Twitter. I don't feel good ever looking at Facebook. I don't have Instagram. I don't know how to manage social media in a way that's entertaining or part of my brand. Like, I just don't know how to do any of that. And it's not like I wouldn't like to do it, because like you'd make a lot more money. You'd have a lot more ease in your life if you could do it. I'm just aware I'm totally dysfunctional at it.
Yeah, I am too. I've kind of pulled way back, and I almost use it almost as just as a different kind of email. Like I just check to see, like, it might be a better way for me to reach a certain person to be there, but I don't. I've kind of had this little social media sabbatical of sorts that started the year, and I just kind of, it's only on my desktop, and I just will plug into it just to be like, oh, I need to message this person who, and maybe find out who their representation is if I can't read, if I can't find it out on my own. Or I came across, as a result of Twitter, I came across like Ian Frisch's book Magic is Dead, like coming out, and like that was, and I was able to request the book and get him on the show, and he was on last year, and it was great. I would have never have come across that were it not for Twitter. So I kind of just use it as I try to use it as a tool, and not like Reese's Pieces at a movie.
Well, and it's funny to me because I went to the New York Public Library, the main library, to see the J.D. Salinger exhibit that was curated by Matt Salinger. And one of my closest friends when I came to New York, we're no longer friends, which bothers me a bit, but was a biographer of Salinger, the first biographer out of the gates right after Salinger died. And he had all this correspondence of Salinger and stuff. And I think I've told you before, like, above my desk now, I have a sign that I pried off with a jackknife from Salinger's property while he was alive in 2006. And some truck pulled up and was like, "What are you doing there? You know where you are? You know you know what mailbox you're looking at and stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, but it's public property, and I'm not going to do anything, and I'm not going to harass the old man." But anyway, I was always fascinated by the world's reaction to somebody who could be on Oprah, who could be wherever he wants, could have Steven Spielberg make Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield, and Leonardo DiCaprio was going to star as Holden Caulfield, and on and on and on, and just says, you know what, fuck you. Who I actually care about is that every individual reader gets to imagine Holden how they want to. And the only place that you can hear his voice is in your head. That's what's important to me. I don't need more money. I don't need more status. I don't need more readers. I don't do any publicity for this thing. And anybody who says, like, there's great publicity in just falling off the map, show me the next person that did that where it worked out really well, right? Like where are the great examples of that? Well, of course, Salinger created this mythic status. Thomas Pynchon is not talked about the way J.D. Salinger is. And by the way, he still publishes, so it's not a fair example. But I was so interested in Matt Salinger gave a couple of interviews about his dad, and he's part of a trust with Salinger's widow, where he said you can look and track society where they talk about Salinger as he stopped publishing, so he is a private man, to he is a secretive man, to he's reclusive, to he's notoriously reclusive. And on and on and on. And it just descends into it becoming pathologized into, isn't he creepy? Isn't he crazy? And on and on. What it's really showing, he says, is it's tracking our own connection to publicity, that to be private, to want to be private, is now looked at as sick, when we know the more time you spend on Facebook or Twitter, the more depressed you become. We're designed to sell ourselves short in how well we're doing in our life and to overestimate the achievements of others. It's designed, like all advertising, to make you feel worse, and that the solution to it is something you don't need that's not going to make you feel better.
Right.
And I just find it so interesting in that I think if you have enough failure, and I mean, of course, Salinger was the most ambitious status whore in terms of, once I'm at the New Yorker, that's all that can be published. Anything that wasn't at the New Yorker is not befitting of being published. So it's not like he didn't have this same struggle decades and decades and decades ago, when people across the country were talking about things like short stories Well, now nobody reads a short story unless you're writing it or teaching it. Who the fuck is mentioning, Brendan, I just read this incredible short story while I was at my construction job? Like, that is not happening.
Right. Yeah.
It's just not part of the discourse. There's not a lot of short stories being sent on Facebook. You know, I mean, people who are not on social media, I guess, which is everybody, but we're just in a different place, right? Where it's not part of the conversation. Writers are not talked about. You know, they had I mean, even Scott Fitzgerald, he died, I think, in 1940, was saying movies have just replaced what we are as writers. We're not relevant anymore. Like, there's just no way to compete with this. I think he called it like the low gear of collaborative art that is movies, you know, which I thought was funny. But it is something I think that is like a real hit to people's egos with journalists, is they're just so desperate to get the attention. Like, I've been listening to the podcast of Ronan Farrow, where good for him for what he did with Weinstein. And my literary agent's wife is Megan Twohey, who with Jodie Cantor, like, also brought down Weinstein, and all that's so important. But to listen to Ronan Farrow endlessly talk about his own process of reporting, it's so self-congratulatory and just smug and embarrassing. And I'm just like, you're an extraordinarily wealthy guy with a lot of status. You're engaged to John Lovett, who's one of the funniest people I've ever heard in politics. But you still need to be, I don't know, just sort of as shamelessly self-promoting as anybody. Like, I think one of the benefits, if you're in a position of security, is you don't have to fucking pander to do any of that shit. But the truth is, it's not about pandering. It's the needs of the people doing it. It's not who they're supplying to. It's that there's just something really fucked up about, like, the DNA of people who want to get involved in this, that I find really troubling. But maybe that's just my own fucking thing. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's always fun to get to talk to you about this stuff, Bryn. I could go on for another hour or two with you, but I think for the purposes of this, we should, we'll table the rest of our conversation and hopefully get to have this more frequently than every 2 years. So yeah, Bryn, thanks so much for being hopping on in short notice, and I can't wait for the Hazlitt pieces to come out, and I of course will eagerly await for your each and every episode of Tourist Information.
Thanks so much, Brendan. It was fun talking to you.
We did it. We made it, CNFers. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure you're subscribing to the show, of course. This crazy show is produced by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I make the show for you. I hope it made something worth sharing, and if you really dig the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Follow the show on the various social media channels at CNFPod across them all. Get that newsletter at my website. Win books, win zines, hang out with your buddy B.O. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Are we done here? We must. Because if you can do interviews, see ya!